Welcome, miniature fans. Today I'm going to talk about my history of painting. Now, some of you might find this interesting and some of you won't, but let's make a start. Now, I want to talk about the paints and the history of the paints that I have used since I started painting. So I started back in the 70s making Airfix model kits. And of course we had the Airfix paint and the enamel paints, Humbrol paints, and they were all absolutely terrible paints. If anybody remembers back then, you had to wash the brushes, of course, after each use in white spirit, and half the time most of us were high as a kite from painting our miniatures. And it wasn't until the early 80s that the paints changed to something magical, and that was the acrylic paints. Now, a couple of companies did the acrylic paints, but it was the 80s when I got into painting fantasy miniatures, and of course I was going into my local model shop and I was looking at all the Dungeons and Dragons figures and all the Citadel miniatures at the time, and back then we didn't have any washes. To actually use a wash on your miniatures back then, we used to actually use dirty water. So we'd have water and we'd mix it with brown paint and we'd mix it with black paint to give us our different colours, to give us that wash, unlike today's paints where you've got an unlimited supply of different types of paints. Now, so back in the 80s, what happened was Citadel kind of came into its own, and they started releasing a few different box sets. Now, this box in front of me there, that was the second box set they released, which was the Hex Pots paints. But before that, they released a smaller, rounder pot, same size pot, sorry, but it was a round pot. But this is the original set that I brought back in the 80s, and this was a game changer for all the hobbyists out there. And even to this day, I still think this was the best paint set that Citadel Miniatures or Games Workshop has ever made, for quality, for price. They had all the core colours that you needed, so you could mix any colour, and the paints were just perfect. The value for money was fantastic, and it was something that we needed so badly at that time. So all these new sets were coming out from Games Workshop, and it was absolutely an amazing time to start being in the hobby. As you can see, I've still got the whole collection. I think I've got every single paint that was released from the Hexpot line from the 80s, early 90s. This is including all the washes. Now, on this wall here, this is just the actual acrylics, your core colours, and the greens, yellows, blues. You've got your blacks, whites, creams. And they did such a fantastic range, and I still try to pick these up on eBay as well to go in my collection. And they are an absolutely fantastic range of paints. Now, moving on, they started releasing all the washes, so we had all the wash paints, and of course they did the flesh wash, and that was again a miracle to happen that we all needed. And then all of a sudden, moving on, it was all kind of, the different companies slowly started producing their own paints, like Reaper Miniatures, Veleco, Army Painter. So what's happened now, in my opinion, is the market of miniature painting pots, as you could call it, it's become oversaturated. There's so many companies doing these different paints now. It's really quite difficult to stick with one company. And I mean, I have got the Army Painter over there. We got all the Army Painter. We got the MSP range from Reaper Miniatures and Veleco over there. We got another set just here. Then we've got over here, we got the Army Painter again. We've also got Forge World, which is a line from Games Workshop as well. So I am using so many different sets from different companies. Now the thing is, it's just so difficult to pick now. When we went back, if we go back in time again, back to this box set, everything seems so much easier. We are now spoilt for choice, and this is not a complaint. It's a fantastic thing that we got all these lovely colours. But what it boils down to is when you've got a set like this, where you've got your white, you've got your black, you've got your core colours, which is red, green, yellow, and red. You can make your own colours. If you can mix your own colours and do whatever you want. So you don't really need to buy hundreds of different types of paints, because when you've got this set, not this particular set, but if you have these colours, you are capable of making millions of different colours and shades yourself just by using these paints alone. I think personally it has become a little bit too much what we can get now, and there's so many companies are making all these different paints. It is a very, very difficult one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the main paints from different companies that I like to use, and hopefully it'll help you in your journey of painting. What I will say about the paints now is, even though back in the day Games Workshop paints were the ultimate paints to have, in my collection now I've hardly got any paints at all that are from Games Workshop, apart from the old hex pots, which are still my favourite paints. But in this day and age, with the battle of all the different companies doing the different paints, what I'm finding is Reaper Miniatures do an MSP line of paints. These are now my favourite paints to use. They come in little dropper bottles, and that's another thing with the Games Workshop paints. If the Games Workshop paints were put into dropper bottles, I think they would be even more popular than they already are with most people. But for consistency in the paint, I highly recommend the MSP line of paints by Reaper Miniatures. And this is for all the core colours as well. MSP is my favourite. Vallejo is very good as well. Now for your washes. Now the washes are a super important part of our painting process. But there's only one wash that stands out in the crowd to me, which is something I've used ever since they released it, and it's my favourite wash for flesh, and that is the Flesh Wash by Army Painter. If you've not tried this Flesh Wash, try it. It's absolutely fantastic. Now remember, my painting is to a tabletop standard, so all you professional showcase standard painters, of course most of you won't use a ink wash anyway, so I'm really concentrating on people like myself who are doing a tabletop standard paint, or higher, it doesn't matter, but I try to stick all my miniatures to a tabletop standard, and this is perfect for your washes for all your skin tones, white skin tones I should say. And of course then we move on to your black. Now the blacks is super important. Now I was using the shade oil, this from the Nun oil from Games Workshop. This was my number one, but of course they've reduced the size of the bottles. It's getting more and more expensive. So what I've done, I've changed to this Vallejo Game Wash dipping formula. It's just the same really as the shade oil from Games Workshop, but look at the size of the pot. You're getting so much more in this one big pot than you are in this little pot. So I use this for nearly all my miniatures now, and it's saving me a fortune, and it's given me a very, very nice effect on all my miniatures. Now there's a huge line of contrast paints out there. Again, this is all down to personal taste. I do like this one from Games Workshop. This is the contrast yellow. Fantastic for doing flames and certain things on your miniatures. But there is a huge line of different colours, contrast paints. They got speed paints now. Now the speed paints I absolutely hate. Some people love them, but for me the speed paints were a total no-go situation. I did make a little video of the speed paints before, and it just didn't work for me. The colours weren't vibrant enough. It just looked terrible on the miniature. Very good if you're doing a huge batch of miniatures, then you can just dip the miniatures or whatever, but definitely wasn't my thing, the speed paints. But what I've shown you here, you can't really go wrong. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little video. I do love talking about paints, and I could probably talk about paints for hours and hours. If you'd like to see more videos on paints in the future, let me know in the comments. I'll be very happy to make more videos. So I've tried to keep this video as short as possible, otherwise I don't want to bore you all silly. But like I say, if you do want to see more videos, let me know in the comments. So until next time.